topic, and we're all facing it, and we're all facing it in order to preserve this earth for our future generations. And I know there are many different opinions about it. I'm sure everyone here has a different opinion, but there are some facts that are undeniable, such as sea level rise, global temperature rise, warming of the oceans, shrinking of the ice sheets, extreme weather events all over the place, all over the world, and so on. But before I turn it over to our expert, I'd like to lay the ground rules real quick, which would be Ambassador Kamal and Mr. Khan are going to have a conversation. After that, we're opening the floor for questions. There will be 2 questions from each location. We will start with Bronx Community College, followed by Lehigh, followed by Vancouver, followed by Florham, and then followed by Metro. So I'd like to turn it over now to our 2 speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back with you at Fairleigh Dickinson and with all the other universities who are joining in, and a greater pleasure to have as our guest analyst Mr. Khan, who is a former diplomat from Pakistan, but who has been in charge of climate change for the government of Pakistan for a number of years, and then for several years now working with the Secretary General of the United Nations as a senior officer in his climate change team. So this is a ranking member of the climate change mafia at the United Nations, and I'm delighted to have him help walk up the complexities of this subject. With his permission and with yours, let me lead into the subject myself. There are some facts about climate change that are well known and well established, and 3 or 4 of them need to be re-mentioned. The first is that the temperature of the world is rising. We know that because for 150 years we have maintained very regular temperature charts, and we know that there is a progressive change upwards taking place in global temperatures. Secondly, we know that as a result of these rising temperatures, the ice caps of the world and the North Pole and the South Pole are slowly melting. In the case of the Arctic, which is the northern ice cap, the northern passage between Canada and the Arctic is now open for travel, to be completely icebound in the past. And in the south, Antarctica, which, as you probably know, contains 80% of the fresh water resources of the world. Antarctica, large chunks of it are breaking off. The last one was a chunk almost as big as Rhode Island, which broke off and has now joined the oceans. That is the melt of the ice caps. The third is the surface temperature of the oceans is rising. We know that, and because surface temperature of the oceans is important, because that is what determines wind flows, we know that the frequency and intensity of hurricanes and rains has increased. All this because of the increase in surface temperature of the oceans. And finally, 50% of the population of the world, half of the population, lives in coastal areas. So anything which affects the oceans, particularly rise in the level of the ocean, is going to affect 50% of the population of the world. Much of this world, incidentally, of the coastal population of the world is low-lying islands in the Pacific, for example, and in the southern Indian Ocean. And these are islands which are going to be completely overtaken by the water. And so the populations will have to move, and the only way to move will be to swim. And if you try to swim from Vanuatu to New Zealand, that's a 1,500 swim. So major changes are going to take place because of population displacement. Now, these are facts which are known and which are undeniable. And the question then is, what is new? What is the debate all about? The debate is not about climate change. The debate is whether climate change is natural or not. How much of it is natural? Because we know that in the millennium history of the world, there have been cold and hot parts of the world. All of this area on which we are sitting in New Jersey, in New York, etc., all of this North America was part of the ice cap. The ice was 1 mile thick all in this area in the past. And so we have known cold climates and we hot climates. The whole of the Sahara in Africa was an ocean, and today it is all desert. How did this happen? When did this happen? Was it natural or was it man-made? Now, in the scientific community, we don't like simple words, because by using complex words, we feel better. It gives us an urge and a push. And so instead of saying man-made, we use the word anthropogenic, which is a word long and difficult to spell, but all that it means is man-made. And so the real question is natural or man-made. Now, in support of the man-made theory, there are 2 or 3 arguments. The first is that if you take the graph, the chart of the temperature of the world, and we know that it is rising, and you put the question then is, where is all carbon dioxide coming from? Why is it suddenly increased in the world? And the answer is that it has increased because all development that takes place requires energy, and all energy is basically fossil fuel based. It's either oil or gas or coal. These are the 3 sources of energy that are used for building development. And so why are we becoming so heavy in our use of fossil fuels? The answer, oil was literally free, almost cheap, to the extent of being free. Please remember that until 1973, the price of oil was fixed artificially by the Western countries, and it was fixed arbitrarily at $2 a barrel. That was the price of oil. It was free. And so if it is free, we were misusing it and overusing it, and that led to overconsumption. And that overconsumption then led to the increase of carbon priority. Do you want us to not have development in the interest of controlling climate change? Or do you want us to have development which means using energy, in which case, I'm sorry, climate change will continue to beguile us in future as it is in the past. So what is the priority? That is my first question to Mr. Khan. What is the priority? Is the priority development, or is the priority saving the world from climate change? I don't know. What I do know is that climate change, global warming takes place. I will die in 50 years. But if development does not take place, I will die from hunger and starvation tomorrow. So for me, the priority is development. But I'm told that no, the priority should be climate change because it is nice and sexy and everybody is worried about it. I want Mr. Khan to walk us through this problem, which I have, in which I believe that development is
done. And my second development goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the third was Paris Agreement. Each one of this agreement was built on decades of experiences. The Hyogo framework was built on, the Sendai framework was built on a Hyogo framework with 10 years of implementation. Agenda 2030 was built on Millennium Development Goals of 15 years of work. And Kyoto Protocol, whether it was good or bad, or Paris, is built on Kyoto Protocol. I was 20, and the second part agreement is post-2020. The pre-2020 agreement is not legally binding. The post-2020 agreement is legally binding. So when we speak of Paris Agreement, we are talking about post-2020 scenario. That's the structure in which the Paris Agreements are built. some of the core elements of that agreement, and I'm going to highlight to you, and then I will also highlight what are the core signals there. The first important point is that the agreement places a global cap on temperature increase. It asks, or it very clearly states out that 2 degrees is the maximum limit, and the efforts should go to reduce global temperature below 1.5 degrees as well. Of course, the basic assumption is that temperature has increased and it will continue to increase. No one can deny that the temperature increase cannot happen. It's consequent. We are struggling, or this agreement is about understanding and grappling with the consequences of that temperature increase and making sure that the temperature increase remains a certain degree low. Then another important aspect of this agreement is that it has removed the distinction that earlier between different kinds of countries, the differentiation debate. Not that each one of the country is now at same level. It's not that Samoa, a very small island in South Pacific, has same responsibilities as, say, United States or China. No, that's not what it means. But each one of them has a responsibility. That's what agreement. All of you, all countries have agreed that we have responsibility to tackle the challenge of climate change. You cannot hide behind or say that my development concerns prevents me from taking action against climate change. No, you have to take action. The agreement is about addressing your development concerns as well, and I will come to that point shortly. That's the second point. You would have recalled, and this is linked to this second element of the agreement, that in run-up to this agreement, 189 countries voluntarily submitted what they called intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. Those INDCs were effectively national climate change plans. The countries were asked to submit. Each one of the countries submitted them with one caveat or the other, one cannot say, but that's precisely that the word came together to address the challenge of climate change. My third point on this is, on the agreement, is that it's a legally binding agreement. When I say legally binding agreement, it means the countries will have to ratify the agreement through their national legislature. And what is the obligation that it imposes? And that's where the flexibility in the agreement is very important for you to understand. The option in Kyoto Protocol was that you, say one country, has to reduce your emission by this level. And that is your obligation. In Paris Agreement, we said you have an obligation to reduce emission, take action against climate change, but what that action is left to you. Obligation has been made clear, but the level of obligation has been defined through a global cap on temperature increase, asking, when you put these two things together, you're saying you have an obligation to work towards achieving this global target. How you do it, you need to define it through your national planning, national action plans, and that you need to clearly show it to the world what action is. That the 100 years of fossil fuel led dimming any certain puts those core elements together, which would lead to a carbon pricing being instituted in at least majority of the world in near future and in the long term across the globe.
You have to explain carbon pricing.
I'm sure I will be able to explain it to you, carbon pricing, later if the question would come, but it's a question of how do you trade. If you put a cap on carbon, a single sources of energy. And just to address that point which Ambassador Kamal had made, during the last 2 years, it is becoming clear from at least one of the studies that has come out, the growth prospects are not necessarily linked to increasing emission by the use of energy. But the growth has continued to happen while emissions have continued to go down. So that the relationship has inversed. For better part of our life, we knew that growth means growth in emissions because it means higher energy consumption. But that relationship is now reversed, or at least it has been delinked from the economic growth pattern. That study has recently come out by International Energy Agency, which is a Paris-based agency. Hope or some of you could have a look at it. My final point here is that there is a very strong signal of political resolve that this agreement gives. From the time that we were in Copenhagen in 2009 or earlier, this agreement very clearly lays out that the international community, the leaders, the world, the private sector, the financial community, and all of us are now clear in our resolve to address climate change. I would leave it, my intervention here, for all of you to, if we can have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, before we open for questions from the universities, I have several points of disagreement with what you have said. My understanding of what you have said is that the chart has changed and that development has been progressively de-linked from energy consumption. I do not agree. I do not see how development can take place. And the only way to replace fossil fuels with renewable sources of energy would be to use nuclear energy. But you are not willing to allow nuclear energy to replace fossil fuels because you say nuclear energy is dangerous, which it is, obviously, because it is double-edged as a source. It can be used for energy, it can also be used for making bombs. And so the danger, the frightening part of it is more important for you than the energy. Okay, so you don't want nuclear energy and you think that you can replace fossil fuels with air and wind and solar. Okay, good luck, but I don't think you can do it. Number two, basically, if you want to convert fossil fuel-based energy into carbon dioxide-friendly energy, you will need to put prices everywhere, on all cars, on all smokestacks. I don't see where the money is forthcoming for that type of an effort. It is not enough to have an agreement in Paris to say, we want a happier world. Where is the money for that world? I don't see the money on the table. When we went into the Kyoto Protocol, you could not produce the money. And that's why the Millennium Development Goals never succeed. And I'm not sure whether the Sustainable Development Goals will find better sources of money. So I'm not too sure about the money forthcoming. Then there is another problem. You are in one fell swoop, you are cutting out all subsidies on energy. In poor countries, water and energy has to be subsidized because poor population do not have the money to buy water or to buy energy. And so they need, and yet it is essential. And the purpose of government then is to provide it to poor populations for free or at token cost. What you are saying is no, cut out all the subsidies. I don't see by what right you can make that statement, particularly since the developed countries, the rich countries, have gone out of their way for decades now to provide subsidies to inefficient farmers. The extent of $1 billion a day is the level of subsidies being provided to inefficient farmers in the developed countries of the West. So I'm sorry, you do not have the right or the character or the background to require poorer countries to make an effort when your whole history is based on misuse of subsidies and overconsumption, which is what led to the development of the West. The development of the West was not because of any marvelous formula that they found. It is just that they were over-consuming. And that is why everybody in the West has 2 or 3 cars. Why can't they use public transport? Because they just don't want to under-consume. They want to over-consume. If you want to over-consume, then I'm afraid you have no right to ask the rest of the world to under-consume, which is what basically you are asking us to do. So please give me a better argument.
Quickly address it. First, obviously, 2 wrongs will not make 1 right. The growth patterns that majority of the countries in the West have undertaken, and you're right about them, that they the economic growth was linked to energy consumption. Increase in energy consumption leads to economic growth. That is the model. What I'm thinking, around 200 million people who have a very long perspective, during which then the old subsidy needs to be removed. Otherwise, the infrastructure is not there. On the consumption, I think all countries, when I said submitted their national determined climate national action plans, they targeted consumption. Those national plans of actions, and I hope some of your students would be able to look at those national plans of actions, they do target consumption. It's not that consumption can be eliminated or energy of consumption can be eliminated, but the countries have put forward going to make transition. All countries are saying, this is what my capacity is. On my own, and I'm addressing your question on finance, on my own, I am willing to do 2%. But if I am able to get assistance from countries other than other countries, I am able to do 12% of emission reduction. The case, if you would look at INDCs from Bangladesh, Morocco, Benin, others, they very clearly say the relationship is financing, that there will be $172 billion for just 4 countries available at the flick of a moment. You have to start looking at sources, which means if you put together or try to account for 198 or 196 nationally determined climate action plans, you are talking about trillions of dollars. I have not done that study. Hope that should be a topic that any professor can pick up and ask their students to actually undertake a assessment of what does it.
Over to you.
But I think that it is as simple as just saying that the thickness of ice has increased. There are studies which says in Kashmir or in different parts of the world or Himalayas, the ice is growing thick. True, but at the same time, flooding has increased. At the same time, weather patterns have changed. The heat wave that has come into Pakistan and India during the past 3 years
and
has
United States,
and including United States, has been unprecedented. Is that simply a turn of cycles between different portions of history of the world? I would not comment, but all I'm saying is that I have evidence right in front of me from different parts of the world confirming that something is not right now in order, and the more we impact on it, the difficult the scenario is going to be. To your question on private sector, there are 2 things that private sector does, right? What is profit? And of course, the risk. Private sector, or the world's financial markets, have realized that there is risk imposed by climate change and there is an opportunity in climate change. Each one of them is measured in money. Risk is always measured in finance, and so is the opportunity measured in revenue. When you put these 2 things together, the businesses have come to realize that there is a risk to their supply chains and there is an opportunity to make a change and make a profit as well. That was first thing I wanted to tell you. The second point is that over the course of at least last year or since 2014, when we planned a climate summit here in New York, which was one of the biggest catalysts for this agreement. We managed to stitch together or bring some of the major players on board. There are coalitions that we were able to structure. The most important element of that exercise was to create market signals. The green bond market has continued to grow from merely $20 billion to now $100 billion. The carbon footprinting of majority of the public pension funds has started happening. The exposure to carbon or investment behavior of the major insurance companies, who are also equally institutional investors, 32 trillion industry, or the institutional investors have continued to shift their investment or some of their assets from fossil fuel-led investment to more greener investment. So that investment behavior has started to change because they are able to recognize the risk, and they're able to recognize the opportunity. There is a new business opportunity and there is a risk element to it.
Over to Lehigh for 2 questions from Lehigh, followed by 2 questions from Vancouver. Lehigh, you have the...
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador Khan and Mr. Ambassador Kamal. My name is Karen. I'm studying environmental engineering at Lehigh, and we were discussing the Paris Agreement in terms of telling developed and developing countries that they have this obligation to prevent further emissions. But what kind of enforcement mechanism is possible to hold countries accountable, developing or developed countries, for their progress or this lack thereof that we might see in a few years?
Okay, second question from Lehigh.
Okay, I'm Dirk Sahagian, professor here at Lehigh. A fascinating discussion, very problematic, and some of Ambassador Kamal's comments had reminded me of some things that our former Kennedy had said, that ask not how climate change will impact the vulnerable populations of the world, but rather ask how economic development of 7 billion people will impact climate change, which then brings us to the issue of climate-friendly development. There are a couple of ways to do that. One is to convert completely to sustainable energy sources away from carbon. The other is to drastically reduce population. Of course, China is the only country that we've seen actually try to address population at all. So the question is, how would you make people do either of these things, either address population or to convert to sustainable energy? One usually thinks of that conversion to sustainable energy by taxing carbon or doing something to internalize the currently externalized costs in fossil fuel. There's 2 of those. There's the external cost of the climate change impacts, and then there's the externalized cost of creating the fossil fuels in the first place. And how would you go about putting a price on those things?
Excellent questions from Lehigh, and I'm always fascinated by the quality of questions that Lehigh always brings forward. The question is enforcement. You can't just say, we want a happier world. How are you going to ensure that it will be a happier world? The answer so far has been that there was an agreement, and it's a legally binding agreement. We've had tons of, there's a legally binding agreement in the world which says, thou shalt not murder. And yet people are being murdered every day. And so legal agreements are not important. It is the enforcement that is important. What is the enforcement mechanism? Can I take you to jail if you do not take proper actions in some country, Mongolia or Vanuatu or wherever? What can I do to you except use the moral weight of the world? And that moral weight may not be good enough. It was not good enough in the Millennium Development Goals, and it was not good enough in the Kyoto Protocol. And so how suddenly can I be sure that you have developed character and truth in your output? So let's take enforcement first. On the question, then we'll do the second question later. Over to you. Enforcement.
Enforcement, or I think there are enforcement mechanisms that you must have seen across the globe. The biggest one being in the WTO, which is a defined enforcement mechanism like a court proceedings that happen. In other treaties, there are review processes in some other treaties. So first, my very initial reaction to this is that do not think that there is or draw a parallel between a national enforcement mechanism and an international enforcement mechanism. They are not one and they're not the same thing. International enforcement has happened through variety of means, either by sending people to certain countries through review mechanisms, through treaty bodies, or through a appellate body like we exist in the WTO. The second point of this is enforcement. I mean, there are treaties, agreed, there are treaties which even prohibit war, but wars are happening. The enforcement does not happen because there is necessarily somebody to police you around. It happens because of the political will at the international level. If the members or of the countries or the leaders who came together and signed on to a global agreement and they represent that political will, your or my basic assumption is that it must be implemented and enforced. If it is not implemented and enforced, the consequences are far, far deeper and much higher than any other. A war, and a certain number of people can get killed. But in this case, the world as a whole would be worse off. And that is a political resolve that the leaders have come forward to. I agree. I forgot to mention that there is an enforcement mechanism. There is a review process of each and every, and linked to my first point that there are different ways in which international community does enforcement. So there is a review process against each and every national contribution. Those will be evaluated by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and give its views how far it is connected to the larger goal of 2 degrees.
If I can just aid on the enforcement mechanism, there is this principle of review, of periodic review. But the real enforcement mechanism will come from you, from the students and the youth. You are the people who have to bring enforcement, putting pressure on your respective governments to perform correctly in delivering the requirements of climate change. Shifting to the second question, which is that of climate-friendly development. I think the reference was that the desirable mechanism would be to somehow control populations. Population is now 7 trillion or 7 billion, going to increase to 9 within the next 20 years. 2 countries have tried to control population. China did it by bringing in what they call the one-child policy. Let's say you were allowed to have only 1 child in a family, second child you were penalized. Now we know that the normal procedure for stable populations is 2.3 children per family. That is what keeps population stable. But most countries are producing more than 2.3 family. China tried one-child policy, and after decades, it has found that that policy cannot be sustained, and therefore it has abandoned the one-child policy as of this year. The other country which tried this was India. India tried to create forced vasectomies, etc. And that did not work either. And the net result was that the Prime Minister who had ordered that policy was murdered by her own security guard. And so I'm sorry to keep Mr. Khan happy. Agree or disagree? You're welcome to disagree.
No, I'm not going to agree or disagree with that point. The only thing I'm going to say is that from our perspective, we believe that internalizing the cost of the externality is very important. And the agreement does give signal towards natural capital accounting and the fact that the cost externality needs to be associated with the GDP calculation and economic growth. I don't think that agreement at any level says that population growth is a challenge. That assessment or assertion has not been made in the agreement. The agreement is talking about new ways of looking at growth. The agreement is talking about that there is a value in looking at technology. The agreement is talking about how technology could be a great equalizer, and the agreement is imposing an obligation on all countries that they need to look at their economic growth trajectories and determine how best they can reduce emissions.
We also tried population control 50 years ago under the theory of Malthus, who said we will run out of food unless we control populations. Well, we did not control populations, but we did out of food. And so there are some doubts about population control. Over to Vancouver for 2 questions, followed by Florida. Vancouver, you have the floor.
Hello, ambassadors. Ambassador Khan, you mentioned that nations contributed large sums of money at the Paris Climate Summit, mostly developing nations, and that you said that they fund developing nations to help with climate change. But you also said that they would need trillions of dollars while only about 100 billion was raised or funded. As you may or may not know, Canada recently switched governments from Conservatives to Liberals, and with that came controversy that the Liberals should not have contributed so much money, which was 2.65 billion, which was $1 billion more than the previous government. So my question, does the funding from developed nations actually have an effect, or should they spend it on home soil?
Second question.
Hello, ambassadors. I think every country has their own way to develop themselves, and I don't think it is essential to follow the steps of United States or China, which was kind of violent in terms of implement. And my question is, why are we still leaning on fossil fuels based approaches while we still have other resources such as like hydro or like geothermal, which is renewable resources, and we still have ability to develop them further? That's my question. Thank you.
Both for you, sir. You have the floor.
I didn't get the first question. What was
The first one was that money was put forward in Paris, and Canada has proposed $2.5 billion, which is more than what was done in the past because it has a liberal government. But there is opposition in Canada to the fact that the government is becoming too liberal. And the question is justified because the world, in fact, is moving away from liberalism towards right-wing approaches, which is what is happening in the US elections and which is replicated in Europe, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary. So a lot of countries are moving towards the right rather than towards the left. So you may run short of money, in other words.
Well, that risk is always there. I don't think that we can say that the flow of financing from one part of the world to the other part of the world would remain constant, or it will continue to increase. The effort is that it should continue to increase. But the more important point is that that effort from a set of countries who are morally or otherwise obligated by certain international agreements to provide assistance to other countries, such as the OECD countries, of which Canada is one of the members. Can that financing would ever be a sufficient equalizer in that debate? And I gave you the example of 4 countries which said it's 172 billion are required. So you need to tap into resources. No country, just let me make this very personal observation. No country can make progress on the basis of assistance. Countries make progress because they are able to craft their economic growth in a way that needs to happen, that gives priority to their own people. Then any assistance can do whatsoever. Assistance, of course, that's one point. So national resources are very important in addressing the challenge of climate change. The second point is, how far can we mobilize the investment behavior and flow of financing towards from the private sector towards these countries, and that effort has started. That country, my contacts or our contacts at the United Nations with the majority of the people sitting in the Wall Street or otherwise suggest that we are going to start shifting the investment behaviors into low carbon investment. And at the same time, there is an attempt to find ways in which there is greater degree of foreign direct investment linked to climate change in the poor or least developing countries. So there are multiple ways of channeling that financing. We have not found a solution. I'm not saying there is a solution. There are multiple ways the international community is working. But yes, that's how we are going to start. The second question was on the fossil fuel-based resources, and you're right. Of course, there are now new sources, and the agreement or the climate change debate is exactly about what you're saying. That we have lived through 100 years of a growth pattern that has a distinct relationship. That the more you consume energy or fossil fuel-based energy, the higher you grow. What we are saying now is energy is constant here. That your use of energy is needed for you to grow out of poverty. But that sources of that energy can change and must change. That technology is an equalizer there. That is why you will see now, and studies have started coming out, that the relationship between energy and economic growth or poverty alleviation has become a bit more, to say, sustainable.
Over to Florum for two questions from Florum, followed by Metro. Florum, you have the floor.
Hello, ambassadors. The students and myself here at the Florum campus would like to thank you both for taking the time to have this dialogue with us today. I know that Ambassador Kamal laid out some undeniable facts to us at the beginning, but how do we know that the problem of climate change is caused by human factors and is not the pattern of heating and cooling that the Earth has undergone for millions of years? How do we know that this global warming wouldn't have naturally been occurring and that the presence of humankind has simply expedited the process?
You have the second question.
Yeah. Thank you again for taking the time to talk about this stuff. My question deals more with development over monetary issues. If the stress deals with developing states, say the third world, try not to use that term, if developing states are producing the most carbon emissions in terms of their development, why don't we shift the attention away from this Eurocentric lens of having conferences in Copenhagen and Paris and shift the lens towards more of have the conversation in Southeast Asia or in Africa? Why not from this Eurocentric lens?
I think we should have the conference in the United States, because this is the country which is creating the major problems in climate change. So why do you want to shift the focus away from here into Africa instead? I'm not clear about the question. Would you tell me why you think Africa should be made to have conferences rather than those who have created the problem in the first place?
My question is mostly coming from the idea that, or the school of thought that developing states, going back to the carbon emissions and the carbon credit and all, that developing states are more likely to produce a majority of the emissions in the short term while they're developing and not caring much for their total emissions. And then once they reach that state of, here's a rethink of the question. If the developing states are producing most of the carbon emissions, if they don't care for their carbon credit, how do you make the transition from, say, state A has produced in their developing state a lot of carbon, how do you make the transition towards, in their post-development, down to a normal level of carbon? So forget about the Eurocentric approach. How do you tell a state that has developed, how do you enforce and tell a state that they have to produce a normal level after they've developed?
Have you looked at yourself in the mirror over the past 300 years?
Whether it's man-made. As I said before, for me, the evidence is what International Panel on Climate Change, a set of 450 scientists looking at the evidence, has been able to craft. For me, that is the basis of the work that United Nations is doing. Conferences in Copenhagen or to the developing country, you are right in many ways that if you look at growth trajectory, what we are saying is also that the emissions would rise in the developing countries and less so in the developed countries. At this stage, if you look at the emission patterns, the United States, China, and of course the vast majority of OECD countries still have the largest footprint on emissions. The emissions are produced here. When it comes to other countries or those who are in the process of getting developed, the emissions are still far less than that of those that exist now, still in the OECD country and by default also in China. Should we look at the future and make this? That is what this agreement is all about. That is what climate change or Paris Agreement has done. Then look at the future. Already you should start working to reduce from wherever you are. If your baseline of emission is 5% right now, supposedly, you are committed to reduce it, and you come up with your reduction and say, I want to reduce during this period by another 2% or 2.1%. So all countries, no matter what their level of development is, has a baseline from...
Yeah, because these are huge countries. China is 1.5 billion people, India is 1.25 billion people. And so you have the impression that we have large footprints. A better guide is to use the per capita footprint in the world. And the per capita footprint of China or India compared to the per capita footprint in the United States or Europe is 1/40th of the footprint here. So it is better to look at the per capita footprint rather than the absolute total footprint. We are, there's no doubt about it, over-consuming energy in the developed countries of Europe, North America, etc., Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And that is because we are used to overconsumption. If you go out to buy a pencil in Staples, you will find that you have a choice of 50 pencils in Staples. You are going to buy one, 49 are going to be wasted. And they're going to be wasted because the capitalist economy is based on the question of choice. And so choice, means overconsumption. And so are you willing to cut down choice? Are you willing to cut down overconsumption? Are you willing to use public transport rather than private vehicles, etc.? And everything that you use, whether it's a pencil or a pen or a glass of water or whatever, has a carbon footprint. And so, overconsumption is the problem. Do you agree or disagree? Man-made. The question was, is it man-made or is it natural? That debate, I remember I attended once the World Federation of Scientists, in which there were about 20 articles read out by scientists. It is man-made. And one article on the question that it was natural. And the criticism was that this one article, which was that it was natural, had been paid for by the automobile industry. And so we have a tendency to look down on any argument about it being natural causes or cosmic rays, etc. And I'm sorry, but that is a fact that people look down on natural causes. Over to Metro for 2 questions.
Hi, my name's Isabel Lehman. I'm a bio major. So Ambassador Kamal mentioned the cost of carbon emission reducing materials in cars, but what is both of your opinions on alternative energies such as solar energy and wind energy that we already have partially in place. Do you feel that those are realistic possibilities for the future?
And then you can ask.
There's a second question.
Hi, my name is Diana. I'm a journalism major. Ambassador Kamal mentioned that development is necessary to keep a good quality of life for the next 50 or so years. The sea level is rising. Do you think being close to the sea will also be able to maintain a good quality of life for approximate 50 years, no drastic change in carbon emissions?
If you did it, you might know. I printed this out.
Yeah. Both of these are criticizing me. So you have to answer them. This is your chance to go for me also.
Well, I think it's important to understand that again the role of sources of energy in which solar and others are going to and have been playing a considerably important role. The criticism that Ambassador Kamal has made since the beginning is not necessarily well placed, because the majority of the countries are now shifting to solar energy, and that is changing the behavior in which energy is consumed. It is becoming far local. In the case of oil and other sources of energy, you needed to have infrastructure, grids, and all that. But in the case of solar and other, even a small, far-flung villagers have been to have access to energy because it is now produced locally. It's produced on your rooftop. It's no longer is transported to you from miles and miles and hundreds of wires and everything to your home. What it is doing is changing the behavior. And that technology, that energy, or solar or other sources of energy will play an exceedingly important role. Particularly solar would be, the price of solar per unit of energy consumption has continued to go down drastically. It is almost become equal to the energy unit produced by oil, and going down to energy unit to be produced by coal. The cheapest one is coal. It costs about 5 cents to produce a unit of energy if it is a coal-based product, which is why it is most attractive for countries, that you can produce cheap energy. But the solar energy or the sources of energy are changing, and I hope that in times to come, China, India, and the others are actually looking at the use of solar energy. Development should be good quality. I have no doubt that development will remain of good quality if the changes that the world needs to do are not about that you stop consuming. It is not just merely about how much do you consume. Yes, it matters, because the more you consume, the more energy is required. And perhaps there is a need for changing to sustainable consumption and production patterns as well. It's not just...
Vancouver is, as usual, present in full strength. And because this has been a very serious debate today on climate change, I'd like to tell you a short anecdote about Canada. I was sitting once at a dinner with Elizabeth Dowdeswell, who was a Canadian leader, who happened to be the head of the United Nations Environment Program, and laughing at my paper. And with this petty years, and poor Elizabeth Dowdeswell had her mouth open like this and just did not know how to respond to me. But that is it. Please, we are totally user-friendly where climate change is concerned. We do not waste anything. We do not throw away anything. When we get parcels, we keep the string and keep converting it into large balls of twine. We don't throw anything. It is the universities.
First, thank you so much for all the questions. I wish we were all together in one room to have a more lively debate, but that is not possible.
That's because he likes the pretty girls in the university.
At least we are able to sit together on a screen and respond to you. What I have learned from this, my resolve for addressing climate change has actually been strengthened from the questions that you have given. Any progress always takes place between two opposing point of views. So disagreement is an essence of progress. It's not something that should be looked down upon. So what I see is that all of us see it as an important question that needs to be addressed. Maybe we come from different baselines and different perspectives or knowledge that we have of an issue, but all of us are concerned that this is something that needs to be addressed. Even if we believe that does not exist, or even if we believe that it exists, we both, or all of us, want to find that solution. This agreement, or what we have done at the United Nations, is to place before you these very fundamentals that could lead to finding answers to whether you are a skeptic or whether you are a believer. The agreement will give you an answer to that conundrum that all of us have in our mind. So thank you so much. I stand more resolved in my view that whatever this agreement should be implemented, and I hope so would you be.
Back to Metro for any last words of wisdom from your end, yeah, and if not, to close the session from your end.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very hot, current topic, what we talked about. I hope everyone listened and everyone learned something. You can start right at home, right, with what Ambassador Kamal said in the end. Recycle, start to use less, start to rethink what you're using, start to rethink if you really have to throw something away or if you can still use it, not so much like throwaway products, what we use all the time. Maybe you want to think about how you take your lunch to school. Maybe you want to buy something that you don't have to throw away, something to recycle. I think they're really small steps that just at home with your family, everyone. And thank you, Ambassador Kamal, as always, and thank you to our last-minute speaker, Mr. Khan. Thank you for coming and making this a great session. Thank you.
And looking forward to being with you again in a week on the terribly sensitive subject of Syrian refugees. Until then, goodbye to all of you from this club at the United Nations. Goodbye. Thank you, sir.